a WikiVidi documentaries production. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Enjoy. Jean-Bédel Bokassa. Jean-Bédel Bokassa, also known as Bokassa I of Central Africa and Salah Eddine Ahmed Bokassa, was the ruler of the Central African Republic and its successor state, the Central African Empire, from his coup d'état on 1 January 1966 until overthrown in a subsequent coup on 20 September 1979. Of this period, he served almost 11 years as president. For almost 3 years he reigned as self-proclaimed Emperor of Central Africa, though the country was still a de facto military dictatorship. His imperial regime lasted from 4 December 1976 to 21 September 1979. Following his overthrow, the Central African Republic was restored under his predecessor, David Dacko. Bokassa's imperial title did not achieve international diplomatic recognition. Born in Ubangi-Shari in French Equatorial Africa, the son of a village chief, Bokassa was orphaned at age 12. Educated in mission schools, he joined the French colonial army in 1939 as a private. He distinguished himself in the war in Indochina, winning medals and rising to the rank of captain. When Ubangi-Shari gained its independence as the Central African Republic in 1960, the new president David Dacko, who was his distant cousin, invited Bokassa to head the armed forces. In 1966, Bokassa used his position to oust Dacko and declared himself president. He then began a reign of terror, taking all important government posts for himself. He personally supervised judicial beatings, and introduced a rule that thieves would have a near cut-off for the first 2 offenses and a hand for the third. In December 1976, in emulation of his hero Napoleon, he appointed himself Emperor of the Central African Empire, with a coronation ceremony in 1977 costing $20 million, practically bankrupting the country. His diamond-encrusted crown alone cost $5 million. In 1979 he had hundreds of schoolchildren arrested for refusing to buy uniforms from a company owned by one of his wives. Bokassa was reported to have personally supervised the massacre of 100 of the schoolchildren by his imperial guard. On 20 September 1979, French paratroopers deposed him and reinstalled Dacko as president. Bokassa went into exile in France where he had a chateau and other property bought with the money he had embezzled. After his overthrow in 1979, Central Africa reverted to its former name and status as the Central African Republic. In his absence, he was tried and sentenced to death. He returned to the Central African Republic in 1986 and was put on trial for treason and murder. In 1987, he was cleared of charges of cannibalism, but found guilty of the murder of schoolchildren and other crimes. The death sentence was later commuted to life in solitary confinement, but just 6 years later, in 1993, he was freed. He lived a private life in his former capital, Bangui, and died in November 1996. Early life. Bokassa was born on the 22nd of February 1921 as one of 12 children to Mindogan Bokassa, a village chief, and his wife Marie Yokawo in Bobongi, a large Mbaka village in the Lubaye Basin located at the edge of the equatorial forest, then a part of colonial French Equatorial Africa. Some 80 kilometers southwest of Bangui, Mbandalou was forced to organize the rosters of his village people to work for the French Forestier Company, after hearing about the efforts of a prophet named Kanu to resist French rule and forced labor. Mbandalou decided that he would no longer follow French orders. He released some of his fellow villagers who were being held hostage by the Forestier. The company considered this to be a rebellious act, so they detained Mbandalou and took him away bound in chains to Mbaigi. On the 13th of November 1927, he was beaten to death in the town square just outside the prefecture office. A week later, Bokassa's mother, unable to bear the grief of losing her husband, committed suicide. Bokassa's extended family decided that it would be best if he received a French-language education at the École Sainte-Jeanne d'Arc, a Christian mission school in Mbaigi. As a child, he was frequently taunted by his classmates about his orphanhood. He was short in stature and physically strong. In his studies, he became especially fond of a French grammar book by an author named Jean-Bédel. His teachers noticed his attachment and started calling him Jean-Bédel. During his teenage years, Bokassa studied at École St. Louis in Bangui, under Father Gruner. Gruner educated Bokassa with the intention of making him a priest, but realized that his student did not have the aptitude for study or the piety required for this occupation. He then studied at Father Kant's school in Brazzaville, where he developed his abilities as a cook. After graduating in 1939, Bokassa took the advice offered to him by his grandfather, Mbalanga, and Father Gruner, by joining the French colonial troops as a tirailleur on 19 May 1939. Military career. While serving in the 2nd Bataillon de Marca, Bokassa became a corporal in July 1940 and a sergeant major in November 1941. After the occupation of France by Nazi Germany, Bokassa served with an African unit of the Free French Forces, and took part in the capture of the Vichy government's capital at Brazzaville. On 15 August 1944, he participated in the Allied forces landing in Provence, France, in Operation Dragoon, and fought in southern France and in Germany in early 1945 before Nazi Germany was toppled. He remained in the French army after the war, studying radio transmissions at an army camp in the French coastal town of Fréjus. Afterwards, he attended officer training school in St. Louis, Senegal. On 7 September 1950, Bokassa headed to Indochina as the transmissions expert for the battalion of Saigon-Cholon. Bokassa saw some combat during the First Indochina War before his tour of duty ended in March 1953. For his exploits in battle, he was honored with membership of the Légion d'honneur, and was decorated with Croix de Guerre. During his stay in Indochina, he married a 17-year-old Vietnamese girl named Nguyen Thi Hu. After Hu bore him a daughter, Bokassa had the child registered as a French national. Bokassa left Indochina without his wife and child, as he believed he would return for another tour of duty in the near future. Upon his return to France, Bokassa was stationed at Fréjus, where he taught radio transmissions to African recruits. In 1956, he was promoted to second lieutenant, and 2 years later to lieutenant. Bokassa was then stationed as a military technical assistant in December 1958 in Brazzaville, and in 1959 after a 20-year absence he was posted back to his homeland in Bangui. He was promoted to the rank of captain on 1 July 1961. The French colony of Ubangi-Shari, part of French Equatorial Africa, had become a semi-autonomous territory of the French community in 1958, and then an independent nation as the Central African Republic on 13 August 1960. On 1 January 1962, Bokassa left the French army and joined the military forces of the CAR with the rank of battalion commandant. As a cousin of the CAR President David Dacko and nephew of Dacko's predecessor Barthélemy Boganda, Bokassa was given the task of creating the new country's military. Over a year later, Bokassa became commander-in-chief of the 500 soldiers in the Central African Army. Due to his relationship to Dacko and experience abroad in the French military, Bokassa was able to quickly rise through the ranks of the new National Army, becoming the Central African Army's first colonel on 1 December 1964. Bokassa sought recognition for his status as leader of the army. He frequently appeared in public wearing all his military decorations, and in ceremonies, he often sat next to President Dacko to display his importance in the government. Bokassa frequently got into heated arguments with Jean-Paul Douat, the government's chief of protocol, who admonished him for not following the correct order of seating at presidential tables. At first, Dacko found his cousin's antics amusing. Despite the number of recent military coups in Africa, Dacko publicly dismissed the likelihood that Bokassa would try to take control of the country. At an official dinner, he said, "Colonel Bokassa only wants to collect medals and he is too stupid to pull off a coup d'état." Other members of Dacko's cabinet believed that Bokassa was a genuine threat to the regime. Jean-Arthur Bandio, the Minister of Interior, suggested Dacko name Bokassa to the cabinet, which he hoped would both break the colonel's close connections with the CAR army and satisfy the colonel's desire for recognition. To combat the chance that Bokassa would stage a coup, Dacko created the Gendarmerie, an armed police force of 500 and a 120-member Presidential Security Guard, led by Jean Izamo and Prosper Mounambe, respectively. Rising tensions between Dacko and Bokassa. Dacko's government faced a number of problems during 1964 and 1965. The economy experienced stagnation, the bureaucracy started to fall apart, and the country's boundaries were constantly breached by Lumumbists from the south and the rebel Sudan People's Liberation Army from the east. Under pressure from political radicals in the Mouvement pour l'Évolution Sociale de l'Afrique Noire and in an attempt to cultivate alternative sources of support and display his ability to make foreign policy without the help of the French government, Dacko established diplomatic relations with Mao Zedong's People's Republic of China in September 1964. A delegation led by Meng Yiang and agents of the Chinese government toured the country, showing communist propaganda films. Soon after, the party gave the car an interest-free loan of 1 billion CFA francs. The aid failed to subdue the prospect of a financial collapse for the country. Widespread corruption by government officials and politicians added to the country's list of problems. Bokassa felt that he needed to take over the Car government to solve all the country's problems, most importantly, to rid the country from the influence of communism. According to Samuel Dacko, a scholar of African government, Bokassa's personal ambitions played the most important role in his decision to launch a coup against Dacko. Dacko sent Bokassa to Paris as part of the country's delegation for the Bastille Day celebrations in July 1965. After attending the celebrations and the 23rd of July ceremony to mark the closing of a military officer training school he had attended decades earlier, Bokassa decided to return to the Car. However, Dacko forbade his return, and the infuriated Bokassa spent the next few months trying to obtain supporters from the French and Central African armed forces, who he hoped would force Dacko to reconsider his decision. Dacko eventually yielded to pressure and allowed Bokassa back in October 1965. Bokassa claimed that Dacko finally gave up after French President Charles de Gaulle had personally told Dacko that Bokassa must be immediately returned to his post. "I cannot tolerate the mistreatment of my companion in arms." Tensions between Dacko and Bokassa continued to escalate in the coming months. In December, Dacko approved an increase in the budget for Izamas gendarmerie, but rejected the budget proposal Bokassa had made for the army. At this point, Bokassa told friends he was annoyed by Dacko's mistreatment and was going for a coup d'état. Dacko planned to replace Bokassa with Izamo as his personal military advisor, and wanted to promote army officers loyal to the government, while demoting Bokassa and his close associates. Dacko did not conceal his plans. He hinted at his intentions to elders of the Ubangi village, who in turn informed Bokassa of the plot. Bokassa realized he had to act against Dacko quickly, and worried that his 500-man army would be no match for the gendarmerie and the Presidential Guard. He was also overwrought over the possibility that the French would come to Dacko's aid after the coup d'état, as had occurred after one in Gabon against President Léon Mba in February 1964. After receiving word of the coup from the country's vice president, officials in Paris sent paratroopers to Gabon in a matter of hours and Mba was quickly restored to power. Bokassa received substantive support from his co-conspirator, Captain Alexandre Banza, who commanded the Camp Kasai military base in northeast Bangui, and, like Bokassa, had been stationed with the French army around the world. Banza was an intelligent, ambitious, and capable man who played a major role in the planning of the coup. By December, many people began to anticipate the political turmoil that would soon engulf the country. Dacko's personal advisors alerted him that Bokassa showed signs of mental instability and needed to be arrested before he sought to bring down the government, but Dacko did not heed these warnings. Brought to you by WikiVidi Documentaries. Would you like to know more?